The story presents the story of Jack Hudson, a veteran of the United States Navy, who remembers a devastating mission that marked his life and those of his colleagues in 1993. The mission, which seemed routine, consisted of recovering classified information from a lost Soviet submarine, the K-13, missing since 1972 in the icy Barents Sea. However, what Hudson and his team found beneath the sea's surface turned the operation into a terrifying experience. The narrative begins with Hudson remembering his childhood in a small coastal village in the state of Maine. The son of a World War II veteran, he always admired his father's bravery and, at 18, decided to follow in his footsteps by enlisting in the Navy. After years of service on several challenging missions, Hudson was chosen to join the Eagle Unit, an elite unit specializing in underwater operations. During this time, he received a call from Admiral Stevens, informing him of the location of K-13 and the urgent need to recover sensitive data before other forces did so. Hudson's team consisted of Sparks, an electronics expert, Boomer, the doctor and explosives expert, and Ian, the rookie. They boarded the Halcon Negro support submarine, descending into the depths of the Barents Sea, a region known for its icy and mysterious waters. From the beginning, the atmosphere was filled with an unsettling feeling, which intensified when they arrived at K-13. The Soviet submarine was intact, covered in algae and rust, but its structure was surprisingly well preserved despite years of neglect. As they advanced through the hatch and explored the interior of the submarine, a feeling of unease permeated the air. The silence that dominated the place seemed unnatural. It was a deep, unsettling silence, not the kind you'd expect from an abandoned submarine. Everything was in order, as if the crew had disappeared abruptly, with no signs of struggle or panic. This mystery left Hudson and his team on alert. As Sparks attempted to access the submarine's systems, he discovered fragmented logs that mentioned voices and hallucinations, which sent a chill down Hudson's spine. The K-13 crew had reported technical problems, but the lack of details and references to supernatural events suggested something more sinister was at play. As the team split up to investigate, they came across cryptic writings engraved on the walls, written in an unknown language. The features were rough and desperate, as if someone was crying out for help in the midst of madness. The atmosphere of tension increased with each discovery, especially when Boomer and Hudson found K-13's engines manually disabled. This meant that the crew had not simply disappeared, but had made conscious decisions to halt the submarine's operations. As they investigated, team members began to hear unsettling whispers, voices that seemed to echo from the walls. These whispers were barely noticeable at first, but they soon became impossible to ignore. Hudson realized that they were facing something much more dangerous than they could have imagined. When Sparks called Hudson to the communications room, the horror they found was indescribable. Bodies of the crew scattered around the room, some dead from point-blank gunfire, others with their heads blown from the inside out. This macabre scene made it clear that something had driven the crew to madness and violent death. Furthermore, a recording captured by Sparks revealed a voice in the same language as the writing on the walls, repeating incomprehensible words that seemed to exert a malignant influence on anyone who heard them. At that moment, the team concluded that they were dealing with a psychic entity imprisoned by the Soviets in K-13, responsible for the madness and massacre of the crew. Hudson's initial mission turned into a desperate race to escape the submarine before the entity overpowered them. However, the escape path was obstructed by debris, forcing Boomer to use explosives to create a new exit. As they raced against time, the entity's persistent breath intensified, invading their minds and destroying their sanity. During the escape, Ian, unable to withstand the entity's mental pressure, succumbed horribly, his head exploding under the psychic influence. Despite this, Sparks managed to discover that the Soviets attempted to use the entity as a psychic weapon, but their experiments failed, resulting in the collapse of the K-13 crew. With the entity becoming increasingly powerful, the only viable solution would be to destroy K-13 and the entity itself. Upon reaching the escape hatch, Hudson and the survivors discovered that the submarine was about to collapse. With impressive courage, Boomer decided to sacrifice himself to ensure the entity's destruction. He programmed the Black Halcon self-destruct sequence, allowing Hudson, Sparks, and Sarah to escape in emergency pods. The ensuing explosion sank K-13 and the entity deep into the ocean, seemingly ending the nightmare. Years later, Jack Hudson, now an elderly man, remains haunted by the events of that day. The whisper of the entity has never completely disappeared from his mind, and he lives with the weight of Boomer's sacrifice and the horrors he witnessed. What began as a simple data recovery ended up releasing something that should never have been disturbed, and the consequences of this supernatural encounter continue to haunt him, leaving an indelible scar on his soul. Hudson is haunted not only by what he saw, but also by what he lost, and the entity, even defeated, continues to exert its influence on the survivors, showing that it is not always possible to leave the past behind. The story of K-13 stands as a grim reminder that in some cases, true terror lies not just in what we face, but in what we take with us after the battle ends. The mystery of K-13 began to deepen as Hudson and his team explored the submarine's interior. The whispering voices that were once just distant murmurs now seemed to echo in their own thoughts, as if the entity was trying to communicate with them. The feeling of despair and claustrophobia increased with each second that passed in that dark place. Sparks, who had previously been confident in his electronics skills, now appeared hesitant, his eyes wide and his face pale. Hudson noticed the change in his friend. The entity's mental pressure was starting to affect everyone. When they arrived at the control room, a heavy and oppressive air enveloped them. Ian, the newbie, was completely silent, his expression distant. Hudson felt a knot form in his stomach. "Ian, are you okay?" he asked, but the young man just shook his head, as if trying to shake off a nightmare that was consuming him. Boomer, ever the pragmatist of the team, tried to remain calm, but even he seemed shaken. The recording Sparks had found in the communications room still echoed in their minds. The voice, distorted and filled with despair, spoke in a language they did not understand, but which seemed to penetrate their souls. "What was that?" Ian finally asked, voice shaking. "What's going on here?" Hudson exchanged glances with Sparks and Boomer. They had no answers. What had happened to the K-13 crew was a mystery that seemed increasingly beyond logic. As they investigated further, Sparks began to find other notes, scribbles on the walls, a mix of Russian and almost indecipherable writing. "The voice calls us," one of the scribbles said. "We can't escape." Horror began to settle in Hudson's mind. What could make an entire crew give up their lives? What was this voice? The questions kept coming, but the answers seemed to flee like shadows in the depths of the sea. The atmosphere inside K-13 became increasingly oppressive. The deafening silence was broken only by whispers and the distant sound of water lapping against the submarine's hull. With every step they took, Hudson felt a presence, as if something was watching them. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling grew, like pressure in his chest. When Sparks pointed to a screen, the image of a painting was blurred, but it was possible to see distorted faces, eyes that seemed to be pleading for help. This wasn't just an illusion. It was a manifestation of something that was beyond human understanding. "We need to get out of here," Boomer said, his voice firm but with a hint of urgency. Hudson agreed, but the way back seemed longer, more tortuous. As they headed towards the exit hatch, Ian began to falter, his steps faltering. I can't think straight," he murmured, and Hudson realized that the young man was struggling against the entity's influence. The whispers were now so loud they seemed deafening, as if all the ghosts of K-13 were rising in unison. The team decided to make a brief stop in an adjacent compartment where they found more traces of the crew. The sight was macabre. The bodies were arranged in a strange way, as if they were trying to escape but couldn't. The air was filled with the smell of death and despair. Hudson felt a wave of nausea, and Boomer had to hold Ian so he wouldn't collapse. The young man was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "We need to focus," Hudson said, trying to rescue the group's sanity. "We need to find a way out." But the entity seemed to anticipate his movements. The lights began to flicker, and a deep sound reverberated through the compartment, as if the submarine itself was writhing under the pressure of an unseen force. Sparks, in a moment of clarity, began analyzing the control panels, trying to re-establish some communication with the Black Halcon. "If we can talk to the base, we can get help," he said, but the insecurity in his voice was evident. Hudson looked around, the tension palpable. What they faced was not a conventional enemy. It was something that fed on fear and despair. and with every second they spent there, the entity's strength seemed to intensify. With time running out and whispers turning into screams, Hudson knew they needed to act fast. He began to gather the team together, deciding they should split up to cover more ground. "Sparks, you and Boomer stay together. Ian and I are going to explore the back of the submarine. We need to understand what really happened here." Fear was visible on the faces of his companions, but Hudson's determination drove them forward. As they separated, a feeling of dread came over Hudson. With every step he took, he felt the entity getting closer, like a shadow moving in the depths of darkness. What they had awakened was about to manifest itself in a more terrifying way, and he knew that if they couldn't solve the mystery and escape, they would all pay a heavy price. The fight for survival had begun, and the true horror was about to be revealed. Hudson and Ian walked down the narrow hallway of K-13, the light from their flashlights flickering like flickering flames in the darkness. The heavy atmosphere seemed to press down on them, as if the submarine itself were a living, breathing existence of its own. The whisper of the entity reverberated in his ears, a symphony of voices that intertwined in a cacophony of despair. With each step, Hudson felt his connection with Ian tighten, as if the menacing presence was trying to infiltrate the rookie's mind. "We need to hurry," Hudson said, trying to keep his voice steady, but insecurity crept into his words. Ian, looking lost, just nodded. The young man was clearly struggling against the entity's influence, his sanity seeming to slip like sand through his fingers. What could make a man succumb to such despair? Hudson felt a chill down his spine, a dark intuition that the answer was closer than he imagined. As they advanced, Hudson spotted a half-open door. He hesitated, feeling a surge of fear. The survival instinct screamed for them to stay away, but curiosity pushed him to enter. The room was in disarray, equipment scattered, and in the center, a table with yellowed documents. He approached, scanning the pages that spoke of strange experiments, of a search for something beyond human understanding. The name K-13 was repeated in several notes, accompanied by terms such as portal and connection. "Ian, come here," Hudson called, but when he turned around he realized that the young man was no longer behind him. Hudson's heart skipped a beat. "Ian!" he shouted, but the echo of his voice seemed to be lost in the darkness. A sharp chill ran down his spine as he realized he was alone. The room now seemed alive, the shadows dancing on the walls, and the whispers intensifying, enveloping him in a nightmare. Panic began to take over Hudson, but he took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It was necessary to find Ian. He left the room and started down the hall, calling the rookie's name. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the feeling of being watched increased. The pressure in his chest was almost unbearable, and the whispers now sounded like screams of anguish. Finally, as he rounded a corner, Hudson saw Ian leaning against a wall, the expression on his face one of pure terror. "Hudson, I can't," he spluttered, eyes wide as if he was seeing something that defied logic. Hudson approached, but the presence around them seemed to intensify, as if the environment itself was trying to separate them. "Ian, you need to focus. We have to get out of here," Hudson said, trying to pull him back to reality. But when Ian looked at him, Hudson noticed there was something different in his gaze, a shadow of something that was no longer human. "The voice. It's here," Ian whispered, and the voice sounded like a mixture of pain and hallucination. At that moment, a pulsating light began to emanate from the end of the corridor, attracting Hudson's attention. He hesitated, but something inside him pushed him forward. What was that light? Would it be a way out or a trap? Without thinking, he pulled Ian towards him and started moving towards the light source. As they approached, the light intensified, revealing a mural of distorted faces, as if the souls of the K-13 crew were trapped there, crying out for release. "Hudson, no!" shouted Ian, pulling him back. "We can't touch this." But it was too late. The light began to spin like a vortex, and before they could react, they were sucked into it. What followed was a wave of indescribable experiences. Hudson saw flashes of memories, not just his own, but those of everyone who had passed through K-13. Moments of despair, of struggle, and finally of surrender. He found himself faced with the horrifying truth. The entity was not just an external force, but a manifestation of the crew's own fear and despair. They had lost themselves in the search for something they didn't understand, and now they were doomed to repeat their mistakes eternally. In a last-ditch effort, Hudson tried to grab Ian's hand, but the young man was being pulled away, the look of terror on his face intensifying. "Hudson!" he shouted, but the light separated them, and the young man disappeared into the darkness. Hudson was thrown back into the hallway, panting and disoriented, his heart pounding in his chest. He was alone again, but now the truth dawned on his mind. They were not just explorers in search of answers, but prisoners of a cycle of horror that defied logic. The entity would not let him go so easily. She wanted him. And with every step he took, the feeling that he was being pulled into her grew stronger. "We need to get out of here," he whispered to himself, determined to escape this nightmare. But as he moved, a new wave of whispers filled the room, revealing that the true horror was just beginning to manifest. The pressure in Hudson's chest increased with each step he took, while the whispers intensified around him. He felt as if he were being watched by thousands of invisible eyes, each of them carrying a fragment of pain and despair. The memory of the pulsing light and Ian's presence haunted him, and the urgency to escape became more and more oppressive. As Hudson turned a new corner, he stopped abruptly. In front of him, a wall of thick glass separated a dark space from a collapsed laboratory. Inside, the shadows seemed to move independently, almost as if they were dancing. Hudson approached, curiosity mixed with fear. He pressed his hand against the glass and it vibrated under his touch, as if acknowledging his presence. It was then that, suddenly, a figure appeared behind the glass. It was a woman, with disheveled hair and a lost look. She seemed trapped, but not just physically. There was a deep sadness in his eyes that spoke of an emotional prison. Hudson felt a wave of compassion, but also of dread. He realized that the woman was not alone. Shadows danced around him, and each of them seemed to carry a story of suffering. "Help me," the woman pleaded, her voice echoing in the laboratory. "They won't let me go. You need to understand. It's not just a place. It's a trap." Hudson felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to help, but something inside him hesitated. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We all seek something we shouldn't. K-13 is a portal, but not to what we imagined. Those who get lost here, they become part of the entity. I was one of the first. The light you saw? It is not an exit, it is a trap that feeds the creature. The entity needs souls to strengthen itself." With each woman's word, Hudson's understanding of what was really happening began to change. He wasn't just facing a supernatural force. I was faced with an echo of all the misfortune that had accumulated over the years. K-13 was not just a submarine, but a receptacle for all of its crew's pain and anguish. "But Ian, I need to find him," Hudson said, his voice shaking with hopelessness. "If you don't act fast, he might become a part of her too," the woman warned, her eyes filling with tears. "You need to go to the center of K-13. That's where the entity manifests itself in its purest form. If you don't stop it, not just Ian, but everyone who comes this way will be doomed. The entity wants you to help it complete the cycle. Don't be fooled." With the revelation, the atmosphere around Hudson began to change. The shadows that danced behind the woman seemed to stir, as if the entity itself was listening. He realized that the woman wasn't just trying to warn him. She was trying to free herself from her pain, and Hudson could be the key. "As you approach, you must stand your ground. Do not be tempted to listen to the whispers. They are liars, and the entity will use your weaknesses against you," she continued, the urgency in her voice growing. Hudson looked at the woman, feeling the gravity of her words. He knew he needed to act, and that if he didn't, not just Ian, but everyone else who had been swallowed up by the darkness of K-13 would be lost forever. Determination took over him. "I will," he replied, feeling a new strength building within him. "I'm not leaving Ian and you. You don't deserve this." With that, Hudson turned away from the glass, hearing the desperate screams of the trapped souls echoing in his mind. He knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but now he had a mission. He was no longer a simple explorer. He was a fighter, and he was ready to face the entity that had tormented K-13 for so long. As he walked away, he felt the entity's presence intensifying, as if it was preparing for an attack. The whispers now became deafening screams, trying to invade his mind. But Hudson focused on the woman's words. He couldn't let the truth he now knew fade away. As he advanced toward the center of the submarine, the tension increased. What he would find there could change not only his fate, but that of everyone who had been lost in the depths of K-13. And somewhere in the shadows, the entity waited, ready to make Hudson yet another of its victims, or perhaps its last hope. Hudson walked down the dark corridor of K-13, the echo of his footsteps mixing with the whispers around him. The entity's presence seemed to pulse through the walls, a constant reminder that time was running out. Every shadow that moved around him seemed to whisper secrets he didn't want to hear, trying to seduce him with promises of power and knowledge. But he forced himself to ignore the temptations, remembering the woman and her warning. A maze of corridors and doors stretched out before him, and Hudson hesitated for a moment, his mind twisting with doubt. He was about to enter uncharted territory, where every choice could mean the difference between salvation and damnation. The weight of responsibility piled up in his chest, and he remembered Ian, how his best friend had disappeared into the shadows, and how his life depended on what action he took next. Urgency drove him forward, but uncertainty made him waver. When he finally reached a sturdy door marked with strange, worn symbols, Hudson felt a rush of dread. He knew that the center of K-13 was there, the core of the entity. With an effort, he pushed the door, which creaked as if protesting his entry. The space that opened up before him was immense, a chamber full of decaying machines and tubes that intertwined like snakes. In the center, a pulsating light emanated from an altar, a mesmerizing glow that seemed to call to Hudson. He felt attracted, as if it was the only way forward. But the woman's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of what was at stake. He would need more than courage. He would have to face his own fears and doubts. With each step towards the light, the surrounding shadows began to stir, becoming denser and more menacing. Hudson felt the pressure of the entity, a power that wanted to control him, dominate him. He stopped, fighting the feeling that his own sanity was being challenged. The voices grew louder, distorted and chaotic, trying to confuse him. "Why are you here? There is no escape. Everyone is lost." "No!" Hudson shouted, his voice echoing in the empty space. He couldn't give in. "I'm not like you. I came to save Ian, not to lose myself." When he pronounced his friend's name, a wave of strength passed through his body. The bond they shared was a thread of light amidst the darkness, and he remembered the joyful moments, the laughter, and the promises made. That connection anchored him, and he felt like he could resist. But the entity was not willing to let him go so easily. The pulsating light began to intensify, and shadows appeared from the ground, forming grotesque figures that tried to grab Hudson. He fought them, his mind a battlefield between the determination to save Ian and the despair that threatened to engulf him. "You cannot resist, Hudson. Join us and find peace," the voices whispered, a seductive chorus that promised freedom from suffering. He closed his eyes, trying to silence the screams and focus on the woman's voice. "Stay strong. Don't believe the lies." Taking a deep breath, Hudson remembered what the woman had said about the entity and the nature of its imprisonment. He realized that, to defeat what threatened him, he would need to confront the very fear that the entity was exploiting. "I'm not a prisoner," he declared, opening his eyes to face the light. With his heart racing, Hudson walked forward, determined to make it to the altar. When he did, he felt a wave of energy go through him, as if he were being tested. He focused on his mission, on the need to save Ian and free the trapped souls. The power of the entity seemed to want to devour him, but he remembered every life that had been lost, every scream of despair that echoed in his mind. "I won't let you win," he shouted, extending his hands toward the pulsing light. He felt the essence of the entity trying to envelop his mind, but he resisted with all his might. The pulsing light began to oscillate, as if it was reacting to his determination. Hudson remembered the woman and her struggle, and the thought of becoming part of her horrified him. In a last-ditch effort, he channeled all his energy into breaking the cycle. If the light was a trap, he needed to turn it into a weapon. The glow began to intensify, and Hudson found himself enveloped in an intense, almost painful energy. He was conflicted, fighting not just the entity, but the part of him that wanted to give up, that wanted to escape the pain. Time was running out. He could feel the entity stirring, a dark force that felt threatened. Hudson knew he needed to act quickly. He began to murmur words he didn't know where they came from, a song of liberation, an invocation of hope. And as he did so, the shadows around him began to writhe, screaming in agony. Hudson was in an internal battle, but also in a fight against an enemy he couldn't see. He clung to his resolve, remembering Ian and the lives that were at stake. The pulsating light began to divide, and the entity, in its fury, tried to silence him. But he would not give up. He didn't know if he could win, but he was willing to fight until the end. Hudson was surrounded by the pulsing light of the altar, a glow that vibrated like a heart in agony. The shadows gathered, trying to get closer, distorting themselves into grotesque figures that contorted in a macabre ballet. It was as if the entity itself was feeding on despair, turning the room into a battlefield between light and dark. What once seemed like an abandoned space had now become a hell of voices and echoes of pain. The shadowy figures advanced, each of them representing a fragment of the fear Hudson carried. He saw Ian's face, distorted in suffering, and the image of the woman, her eyes filled with sadness. The pain and guilt intertwined, trying to trap him in a suffocating embrace, but he refused to succumb. "No!" he shouted again, his voice resonating with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "I am not a prisoner. I will not give in to you." The entity, like a serpent coiling around its prey, stirred, trying to crush him under its weight. The altar pulsed, now more intensely, as if the room itself were breathing, and Hudson felt the light become a weapon in his hands. He remembered the stories he had heard about K-13, a legend of a power that could both save and destroy, and the responsibility of his choice weighed heavily on him. Concentrating, Hudson began to speak words that came from a place deep within him, a chant that was both an invocation and a challenge. "I cry for freedom, freedom not just for me, but for all those you have imprisoned." The shadows hesitated, as if his voice had a tangible effect on them. He saw in them a weakness, a fragmentation of the strength that had once seemed unshakable. The entity, in its fury, released a wave of dark energy that spread throughout the environment, an attack that aimed to break its resolve. Hudson felt pressure against his body, as if he were being crushed by an invisible weight, but instead of backing down, he remembered Ian and their friendship, the promise that they would always have each other's back, no matter what. The thought of losing that filled him with new determination. "You can't stop me!" he shouted, his voice reverberating like thunder. He took a step forward, defying the darkness. The altar began to glow even brighter, and with each word that left his lips, Hudson felt the light expanding, pushing the shadows away. The entity, sensing the change, writhed in a desperate fury, the grotesque figures crumbling into screams of anguish. "You don't understand what you're doing," whispered the entity's voice, a distant echo full of despair. "The truth you seek is more terrifying than you can imagine. You can't save anyone." The statement hit her like a blow, but Hudson didn't hesitate. He knew that the truth was complex, and that the pain of each trapped soul was real. "Maybe I can't save everyone, but I won't let you keep doing this," he stated, his voice firm and resolute. He was confronting not only the entity, but also his own insecurities, the fears that the entity had tried to exploit. As he spoke these words, the light from the altar emitted a blinding glow, and the shadows began to dissipate, as if burned by the intensity of what Hudson felt. He was binding not only his strength, but the strength of all the souls that the entity had imprisoned. The memories of each life lost, the desperate screams, the pain and suffering came together in a single cry for freedom. Then, in a decisive move, Hudson reached out toward the light, channeling his emotions, his determination, and the connection he still had with Ian. The light began to focus into a glowing sphere, a pulsing point of energy that seemed to attract everything around it. The shadows screamed, writhing in agony, as the entity struggled, increasingly weakened. "I choose the light. I choose life," Hudson declared, and with a decisive movement launched the sphere of energy towards the entity. The impact was deafening. The room shook, and light exploded in a spectacle of colors, as if time itself had stopped. The shadows were swallowed up, screaming in despair, as the light expanded until there was nothing left. When the dust settled, Hudson fell to his knees, panting, his body exhausted, but his spirit vibrant. He looked around and saw that the chamber was now silent, the altar glowing softly, as if waking up from a nightmare. He didn't know if Ian was safe, but he knew he had accomplished something. He had faced the entity and claimed his own freedom. The battle was not over, but this was a step towards the light, towards what came next. Hudson fell to his knees, his body shaking with exhaustion, and his mind clouded with the echoes of the battle he had just faced. The light that had expanded and consumed the shadows was now reflected in his gaze, a soft flame that illuminated the darkness that still lingered in his spirit. He had defeated the entity, but the price of that victory was a weight he would carry forever. The altar, now free from the dark hold, emanated a serene glow, as if it were at peace after centuries of torment. The walls of the chamber, once so hostile, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, and the shadows that had danced grotesquely dissipated, leaving only a faint remnant of a tormented past. However, for Hudson, the battle was not over. The echo of the scream still resonated in his mind, and the distorted images of those he loved were burned into his memory. As Hudson caught his breath, he felt a sharp pain in his chest, a mix of relief and sadness. He had freed the imprisoned souls, but what was left of him? The fight against the darkness had revealed not only his fears, but also his vulnerability. The weight of guilt and responsibility crushed him. Ian and the woman he loved were still there, at the edges of his consciousness, memories that couldn't be erased. He wondered if he would ever be able to look Ian in the eye again, knowing that the pain he had faced was a reflection of his own failings. The consequences of that night were profound and irrevocable. Although the space around him was now free of the entity, Hudson felt that he himself would never be the same. The feeling of emptiness that accompanied him was like a black hole in his chest, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the struggle he had fought. He had faced death and darkness, but victory had its price. The emotional scars left by the battle were deep, and the feeling of being watched, as if darkness were still lurking somewhere, did not leave him. Slowly rising to his feet, Hudson realized the path ahead would not be easy. He needed to face not only the repercussions of his choices, but also the ghosts that now inhabited his mind. Every step he took outside the chamber felt heavy, as if the ground was trying to pull him back into the darkness. He looked back one last time, feeling a connection that stretched beyond time and space, a bond with those he had freed, but who were now lost forever. Hudson left the chamber, the light of the altar still shining in his memory, but the outside world seemed different. The colors were more vibrant, but the beauty of the day couldn't ease the pain he felt. Life went on, but he carried a weight that few could understand. He had faced the darkness and triumphed, but the battle within had only just begun. As he walked towards the horizon, he knew that the search for truth and inner peace would be a lonely path. The questions that haunted him would remain unanswered, like shadows that danced in his mind. What he had learned that night was that light could be a powerful weapon, but it also had the potential to expose the darkest parts of himself. Hudson took a deep breath, trying to ground himself in reality. He could not forget what he had seen, nor the lives he had touched in the fight for freedom. And as daylight enveloped him, he knew the journey was far from over. He would always be searching for redemption, one step at a time, in a world that now seemed both full of hope and pain. The freedom he gained had a cost, and that cost was a transformation he could never have predicted. Hudson continued his journey towards the horizon, the weight of his experiences still pulsing within him. Each step was a reminder of the struggle he had fought, but also an affirmation of his resilience. He knew that the freedom gained did not mean that the darkness had completely disappeared. It still whispered in his mind, like a shadow that never quite left. As he walked, his reflections became deeper. The battle against the entity had not just been a physical fight, but a personal revelation. He had come face to face with his deepest fears, his insecurities, and the emotional scars he carried. A part of him longed to go back, to not have to deal with the pain of responsibility. But another part knew that this pain was, in some way, a sign of growth. In his mind, the voices of those he had freed echoed, each representing a life cut short, a story untold. He wondered if they, now free, would find the peace he sought, and all the while he struggled to find his own inner peace. The feeling that he could never completely free himself from his guilt and pain followed him like a lurking wolf, ready to attack at the most unexpected moments. In the distance, the landscape began to change. The sunlight that once felt like a comfort now felt like a cruel reminder that life moved on. even as he felt trapped in his own torment. He realized that although the entity had been defeated, the boundaries of reality as he knew it had been expanded, revealing a world where light and dark coexisted in a delicate balance. And then, when Hudson least expected it, a new sensation began to emerge from his grief, a renewed determination. He decided he would not allow the echoes of his battle to define him. The past could not be changed, but the future was in his hands. With each step, he made a silent pact with himself. He would not just be a survivor, but a seeker of truth and meaning. Upon reaching a high vantage point, he stopped to gaze at the vastness before him. The mountains rose majestically under the blue sky, and nature pulsed with life. Hudson understood that despite everything he had lost, there was beauty and hope ahead of him. He took a deep breath, feeling the gentle breeze caress his face. It was a reminder that even in the midst of pain, life continued to offer opportunities for renewal. As he watched the horizon, a new truth formed in his mind. The struggle would never completely end, but that didn't mean he couldn't find joy and purpose. He could use his experience to help others face their own battles, share their stories, and find strength in vulnerability. The love he felt for Ian and his beloved could be a light that would guide him, even on the darkest nights. And so, Hudson decided that his journey would not end there. He turned, not to look at the darkness he had left behind, but to step forward into the unknown, with new purpose and renewed hope. He might not have all the answers, but the search for truth and redemption was a path he was willing to take. As he walked away, one last thought crossed his mind. Light and darkness would always be intertwined, but it was in accepting this duality that he would find his true power. And with that, he smiled, feeling the weight in his chest begin to dissolve, giving way to something new and vibrant. Hudson knew his story was not an end, but a new beginning. And so, he moved forward, inviting everyone to reflect on their own battles, the courage to face their fears, and the beauty that can emerge even from the shadows. May everyone find the light within themselves, even in the darkest moments. Share your experiences and reflections, because every story counts, and together we can light each other's path. Like and subscribe so we can continue this journey of discovery and growth. The transformation begins now.